Thank you for taking the time today to come and join us on a day that started with snow and gale, but I can see some blue skies coming through. This will be our service transition and mobilisation deep dive. It is, here we go, a little bit of housekeeping as we start off. Yeah, a little bit of housekeeping as we start off. We'll be muting kind of cameras and microphones in the background. We will be making a recording of today and we'll make it available to you all after the session. The slides too, we will make available to you as a pack. There are a number of documents that I'll be referring to as well during the session, which will bundle with that as well. We'll also have a couple of, let's call it breakout sessions where we'll be asking you for your thoughts and opinions. What we'll do after today's sessions is try and bundle those together into key thoughts and points, and we'll input those into the slide deck itself and share those too. So it won't be a case of we'll send you the slide deck at close of play today, because we'll want to bundle those ones together. All right, so I thought I'd start with a recap and update on where we are with the CBDA grant scheme in relation to mobilisation and service transfer. During the summer and into the autumn, we came out to you and we asked a number of questions about mobilisation. Firstly, around the costs and activities that you were identifying or thought should be included within that. And then secondly, we asked you what content you thought would be really helpful for us to run in the deep dive session today. And we've reviewed that, and this is effectively what you've told us you want to talk about. So the agenda today really has been driven by you and what you thought it would be helpful for us to cover. So I put it in these quite broad categories. We've got the timelines themselves and the budget assumptions. We've got client continuity and avoiding disruption. We've got TUPE and staff retention, exit planning and redundancy, project management and partnership onboarding, and data systems migration and information governance. And broadly speaking, we can actually bundle these a little bit more into categories of your workforces, in the sense of like their stability, knowing what's going on, the governance and compliance elements. So a lot of you will be setting up new partnership arrangements and working practices, and you're looking to see what we as MAPS can help you with, or indeed support an environment where you can help yourselves. There was a very strong message that came through around clarity of timelines, knowing what you might be expected to do at which point and when, and then actually realize them. Obviously, many of you were concerned about cliff edges and us not giving enough time to do some of these activities. And when we're dealing with clients and your own people, actually, we need to get that right, and we need to be in a place where incumbents, new providers, new partnerships all know what they should be expecting to get from whom and when, because there was a real strong message coming through that it's the uncertainty which is a real potential negative within those environments. So, as I say, this is what you've asked us to talk about today. It does mean that we'll have slightly different audiences for some of the sections if you're planning to be a lead of a new partnership or a person within that. Similarly, some of this will have more of a, let's say, a HR specialist element to it. Some of it will have a partnership and engagement manager element to it as well. And then some of it will be like the day-to-day nuance. So I do appreciate there will be different audiences where it'll feel more or slightly less relevant to you. And that's why we're leaving some of these points open for reflection to enable you to go back within your organizations, mull them across, and come back to us with further thoughts after we've kind of concluded. In terms of where we are in the process, obviously we've conducted a number of initial market engagement and feedback surveys over the year so far. We've been out in the regions over the summer and the winter, and we're now into the deep dive sessions. We've had one already on service design. Catherine and the quality team delivered their workshop last week. We're doing service mobilization today. And then next week we've got, or at least nearly next week, in a fortnight's time, we've got the data and evidencing strand run by, I think, Tamsin and Ben. We'll be moving into initial expressions of interest in December, and then in the new year, we'll be coming out to the regions again for phase 3 of market engagement, where we'll be providing spaces for people to meet, congregate, sort of network and put together their partnerships, but also, and this is going to be my spoiler for the next slide, we're going to be looking at doing smaller, more bite-sized sessions on specific topics. So these will be led by Matt Cooper, who's recently joined MAPS, and he's got lots of good practical experience of having managed similar services and working in partnerships before. I was speaking to Matt earlier in the week, and he was saying that whilst this is the list of topics that people have told him so far that they're keen to talk about, or at least make space to talk about during those bite-sized sessions, it is a menu and it is open for additional things. So if you get to the end of today's session and it sparks something and you think, no, I want more time to talk about that when we come out to my region, that's absolutely fine. There will be an email address right at the very end of this, letting you know where to make those suggestions come to. And I can see also that we've got the chat open as well, and Erica's in the meeting answering some questions as you come through. The way I plan to do this is I'll do it sort of by sections. I'll take questions at the end if there's time, and we'll also have some Slido-based exercises where we're trying to gather your thoughts and reflections, and I'll try and bring some of those thoughts back where I can see patterns and trends. If there's more time at the very end of this as well, I can open it up to the floor for a general Q&A too. Cool. Alrighty. So we've got, first off on the docket was timelines and budget assumptions. And the way I structured most of these slides is you'll see some text in light blue at the top. And that's where we've taken the analysis of what you've told us in the previous market engagement to kind of play it back. So these are your messages that you've told us that you either want to cover today, or you think it's really important that we get right and cover in this. So as I said right from the top, you told us very strongly and very clearly that what you wanted was a transparent and realistic timeline. You wanted to make sure that we had considered recruitment, retention, training, and in fact those, let's call it softer overlaps that will occur during the period of time, because if you're setting up a new partnership, you don't want everything to go live on day one. You want to make sure that we've got space for staff to familiarize themselves, let's say, with the new brand, the new partnerships, the new ways of working that you might be doing, and to be more familiar with, let's say, the new lead organization that might be coming in to support them in their work. So secondly, we also talked about wanting to ensure that for existing debt advice clients, there was as little service disruption as possible, and we needed to give you enough time to get this right, be able to draw off your expertise and understanding. So without further ado, we've put together a high-level timeline for what service transfer could look like. So the way this is structured is we've got the broad timeline at the top in terms of dates, and then we've got mapped out the existing services that are happening already. So we know this is going to happen in 2 different rounds of commissioning. So round 1, I have put in this sort of buff yellow orange, round 2 in minty green. And we know, for example, that different regions will come online and overlap or dual run at different times. So for example, the currently funded EMMA and GMAP partnerships in the East Midlands and the Northwest, their services will come to a conclusion in the current funding environment as part of round one. But then London, which is currently run through Debt-Free Advice and Toynbee Hall, that'll be in round two. Citizens Advice covers the majority of the rest of the regions across the country, and as a consequence, their current services and partnerships are a mix. So some will be in round one, some will be in round two as well. Now, this is the timeline from the highest possible level. You can see that we've tried to put as much time as we can for mobilization in this. So in the plan, we've got 3/4 or 9 months, but that's very high level. You know, you want a bit more detail from us. That's been the message loud and clear. So what I've tried to do on the next couple of slides is actually start to break down what we think that timeline could look like in terms of expectations of the individual steps that come underneath that. So from a maps perspective, which is what the sort of the first section is on the round one, we're illustrating what we could do to help partnerships set up their processes and indeed their programs. So we've got the obvious grant award with nice conversations and congratulations. We've got due diligence, which will start before the grant is actually signed, but continue throughout, depending on the nature of the partners and who you're bringing on board. We've then got the sort of the mobilization activities as well. So within MAPS, what we've tended to do initially is a familiarization session with the lead partner that's going through the terms and conditions of the grant agreement itself. Whilst you'll have access to this, I think, before signing, there's obviously nuance within kind of like legalisms, and we want to make sure that you understand very clearly the obligations and expectations over that 9 months of mobilization, but also into delivery as well. And it's better to just be open and transparent about it in the conversations with us if something isn't clear or is ambiguous and you don't quite know where the responsibility lies. Similarly, it's a time for us to work with the lead partner as well, going through your proposals. We will have asked questions during the scoring and the monitoring sections, but there's individual minutiae within there, and there'll be slight inconsistencies, which we'll want to sort of like iron out and really make sure that we understand what's going on and how we can help. And then we'll run a number of familiarization sessions with that lead partner, who can then bring in members of their supply chain if they wish, and we'll go through the things you might expect, such as how the project management or monitoring will work from MAP's perspective. So going through reporting templates, talking about the level of detail or not that actually were required during that time, the data and reporting systems. So there'll be opportunities for you to create dummy runs of data sets, sending it across to us so that we can see if it's containing what we think or if it's formatted in a particular way. Because again, we really want to avoid that sort of harsh cliff edge of nothing being particularly tested or worked through before go live on day one. That's not good for us, and that's definitely not good for you. Catherine last week talked about some of the activities that could happen during the QA and the MAP standards monitoring process. So I'm not going to repeat what she said, and that recording is live. But also around how comms and engagement could work, because we need to get our messaging right. We know that whilst there'll be good news for some people, whilst we announce these big, bold, and exciting new partnerships with you, it potentially means some disappointment for some people. And we want to make sure that we manage those messages correctly, because those who might not have been successful, there could be, you know, nervous by this, not knowing entirely what the circumstances look for them. And secondary to this, we've also thought about, actually, we're within the grand scheme of mobilization. We know we're going to be looking at client transfers. We know we're going to be looking at the potential for the transfers of people and staff within existing services. And the message that we heard loud and clear from the previous market engagement was, we want transparency in what that would look like. We want to know at what point certain assessments will be done, and we'll know the result of this. If you're an existing incumbent supplier as part of one of the bigger partnerships we've got at the moment, you've not been a part of a service that is continuing to be funded by MAPS, you want to know at what point you're going to get information on where CHUPI either would apply or wouldn't, and have that decision. And especially if you're in a region where there's going to be multiple leads running, it's helpful, we think, for you as a new lead and a new partnership and the people currently delivering these services to know by this date within the mobilization, I'll have had my assessments and I'll have had my decisions so that I can communicate that clearly and openly with my staff. That said, we are still open to the feedback from you that actually maps, back off. You don't need to give us milestones for these things. We can manage this within our partnerships. We trust each other as a sector that we'll get this done and get it done to time. On reflection, we've put this suggested timeline out there, and if you think maps, it's not going to take that long, you can stick shift things a little bit further in the timeline. We are absolutely open for that sort of feedback and suggestions to it, because there is pros and cons to both, depending on what you're proposing to do in your region and how you're proposing to mobilize your service. This places an expectation that within the new program leads, during those initial phases of mobilization, almost immediately after award, you will have people and staff in place who will have the time and capacity to do that staff assessment, to do that 2P work, to start thinking through the client process, and when we're thinking of things like client transfers and brand, this is making the assumption that your new brand, let's say if you're creating a new partnership, you're going to give it a cool new name and a logo to be reflective of your region. This makes the assumption that that'll have been done before go live date and before the start. And obviously that has a knock-on effect to when you need to be planning to do your work. And you could rightly say to us, it's none of your business when we're doing that. You'll see it in our proposal. You'll see it in our spec. Don't impose that within the timelines that you're doing here. And that's a perfectly valid response for you to make, but we do need to hear it and we do need to know. I've done the same, obviously, for round two. This is essentially moving the same set of criteria and milestones further down on the timeline itself. One of the additional things to note and be aware of is during the round one activities, we'll be looking to onboard a strategic evaluation partner. So this is an external organization that we're going to be bringing in to support us with capturing lessons, recording problems that may or may not have occurred during the time. And we want to start applying that to the secondary phase. So if we've learned something in round one that didn't quite work as polished as we'd liked, we do want to start applying that to round two. So there is the possibility that the round two sort of timelines that I'm indicating out here might actually then further change to reflect that learning and that best practice that we've got. To answer Vic in the chat, yes, the slides will follow this, and you'll have time to go through and interrogate them with your people in due course. So what I wanted to ask from this, because there's a philosophical question that comes with it, which is, does that feel like the right approach from us? Should we be going into that level of detail? Should we be placing some expectations on milestones and activities that occur during mobilization that will impact not only the incumbents, but you as new partners setting up those relationships and structures? Are there things, because I did this as a relatively high level, are there milestones and time points you think that we should be including within that to set that framework of expectation? Or actually, do you think we're setting up a bunch of potentially poor consequences of doing that, and you think we should be less prescriptive about some of this and allow you more flexibility within your proposals to develop these things during that 9-month period? All right. The next thing that we wanted to talk to you about was this concept of dual running. And to kick it back to the deck, the slide that I was previously sharing, we know that we will have a period of time where the incumbent organizations are still running, they are still live. We got strong feedback from the previous market engagement that a recognized and formalized demobilization phase would be very welcomed. We had suggestions around that might mean that MAPS expects, let's say, just less clients to be supported as incumbent staff are being trained up on the new processes, systems, brands, etc. of the partnerships that they're undertaking in the future, and that time is made available within, let's call it the capacity of those organizations to do so, which seems quite reasonable to us. And we know that mobilization of the new activities is going to occur at the same time. So it's entirely possible to give an example that during that 9 month period of time, you might have had the grant award, you might have plans to, let's say, expand into a new element of your region that is currently underserved. If you're bringing in, let's say, trainees to do so, we know that a component element of that will be both their training, but also call shadowing, call listening, but also delivering calls and advice to clients with appropriate QA and support around it. Now, if that is happening during the mobilization period, we should be actually capturing that, looking at that, and monitoring and ensure it's going ahead. So there are some real opportunities here, I think, during that dual running phase where we can head off a lot of the historic, let's call them cliff edges that we've seen when services have ended and new ones started. And what we've been trying to understand is how we could harness those opportunities, but not inadvertently create consequences from it. So our thoughts on this are by doing and acknowledging that those two things are happening at the same time, it does give you time to establish that new way of working with each other. It does give you the time ahead to undertake potential training. It creates less of a hard edge between partners and staff if we're saying that you can have sort of like a phased move across. It does mean potentially that partnerships, especially where you're bringing in new partners that haven't, let's say, worked with MAPS or been MAPS funded before into your region, could start doing soft launch of activities and trialing. It also means that client transfers could potentially take place over a more staggered age period. So we're not waiting until the last day of March and then it moves in April. And it also means that you can start testing systems and processes with clients before that hard launch day to see how they work. So as I say, there is some potential here for client support before go live. And what we were curious from your perspective was your thoughts, concerns, and indeed positives associated with that. So are there here some opportunities that we should be considering? Are there some unintended consequences or actually some risks of that approach or activities identified? And can we put in place now, before we launch and we go live, mitigations and strategies and expectations to prevent some of those things happening? Because again, we want to get it right in a way that works for you, but doesn't impose, let's say, negative consequences both for you and clients. So I've got another Slido, and again, these will be open. They are not going to close at the end of this meeting because some of these considerations will have an SME element to them. So I've been speaking quite extensively to our own MAPS internal HR SMEs and processes to understand actually if we start staggering people across, what does that mean in terms of TUPE, resolving current issues within the current process, and even things like complaints and client detriment. But I'll come to client transfer in a second. Budgeting assumptions. So just for clarity, the mobilization period is the phase after the grant has been signed and is when the service is being set up. Demobilization and exit are when the services are being wound down. Having looked at the feedback that you sent us over the summer on this, we've got a fairly good picture of the cost assumptions when it comes to both, I think, new partners and indeed existing sort of partnerships as well. What we got some pretty strong feedback on, though, was questions about the types of activities that would be allowable under that mobilization phase itself. The can I do this? Can I do that? And whilst we don't want to be too prescriptive, because we want to give you the flexibility to create a service that reflects your region, um, there are some guidances and definitions that we can give you and we can share. So I mentioned at the start of this that we'll be sharing documents as part of this session today. We've put together one that seeks to define and put a little bit of groundwork around allowable mobilization costs. So to pick a slightly trivial one, but one that's easily understandable, you'll be moving around a lot during your region or setup phase. And simply put, we're not going to allow, for example, like first class train travel during that period or private helicopters to go around. I say that because it's slightly fatuous, but it's an easy one to kind of grasp. But there are some more nuances in there. It's definitely one you in the sense of like partners and lead partners will want to consider in terms of like the allowable costs and what it might mean for your potential bids, because it's not locked in stone. If we've written something that means that actually the model you're proposing won't work, now is a really good time to tell us this, so that we can reflect and adapt rather than waiting to the point where we actually launch next year, and we're trying to answer you during that kind of clarification phase. We do have a couple of other notes to do around like budgets, because we got asked these questions as well. So whilst this will be a grant funding, and we make the assumption that as a consequence it'll be VAT exempt, we do note that certain elements of your delivery and indeed mobilizations could incur VAT charges against them. So you will need to plan for that. And then a big thing that we do absolutely want to stress in this and in other sessions, we have a long mobilization period, and having listened to what you said in terms of the cost and the time it takes to mobilize the service, when you're planning for what you're going to do in the future and you're budgeting against it, big piece of learning. Make it realistic. We know that if you're planning on setting up new IT systems and structures, they tend to run long and they tend to cost more than you think, and there tends to be testing involved. Um, don't undercook them when it comes to putting in your bids. Um, it may always be tempting with any form of commissioning or award work to think, I've got to make this the lowest price possible because that'll make me look tempting. But if we're seeing that you are proposing, let's say, customer case records and file or CRM systems integration, that's going to come as a cost in both time and resources and expertise within your organization. So do strongly try and put in the true costs for these things in your mobilization budgeting plans and assumptions, because it'll only essentially hurt you and us and the program in the longer term if you try and make a calculation now and it doesn't bear fruit. So what we're going to send you as part of the pack after this event, and I'm not going to go through all the slides and definitions for it today, on the grounds that it's quite long and quite technical, and I appreciate the audience that we have is not, let's say, all budget specialists, but we've put this document pack together which talks about the types of costs and activities that you could incur and undertake during mobilization, a high level definition of what that means, but what it might also preclude doing. As I say, there'll be an email address at the end for you to reflect and give commentary back to us if we put something in there that actually means your organization or your proposed model might work, might not work. And this is a really good time to give us that feedback so we can review and iterate before we go live. Um, I'll pause for a second because we're nearly making up time. Did anyone have anything specific on budgetary assumptions during mobilization that they wanted to raise or cover now? You could put it in the chat, or you could raise your hand if you want to speak to it. Excellent. I don't see any hands. It is, as I said, we'll be doing some phase 3 regional engagement activities in the new year. So if there are things that you want to cover in there, that is a perfectly fair thing to ask us to put on those agendas as well. Aha! Prompting a later question, Lucy Draper. Yes, so Cyber Essentials Plus, we recognize is a requirement, certainly for the lead partners at the point of signing. It is a legitimate cost of mobilization if you do not have one, and it is something that you can calculate and include within those budgets. I'll come to Cyber Essentials later, because that was also one of the explicit points that people asked us to cover during this deep dive session. But yes, if training qualifications and essentially setting up your systems and processes, perfectly legitimate mobilization cost. I do appreciate, though, that for some of those, the timeline is quite long to getting that authorization and indeed audit. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about was, or were asked to talk about, was client continuity. Again, your thoughts in blue, which essentially was emphasizing that we didn't want to have any abrupt breaks or disruption in the service during that transition, that we wanted to make sure that from a customer perspective or client perspective, their quality of service and support doesn't change during the transfer period. And that is one that we absolutely agree with as well. And we were thinking, practically speaking, what we can do to assist and facilitate that. And it's the running theme with a lot of this, that the clear outrider for this was the idea that there should be clear comms, and both incumbents, new providers, etc., should know what and when they should be expecting to get, and the level of detail within. So I've tried to start thinking about what that could mean in terms of the different scenarios and how those interactions would actually work. So we'll be in a situation where we have our current providers, and we'll be coming to the end of the delivery phase, and the existing client support is either not or is expected to be concluded. So essentially, somebody comes to you in the latter months of our existing services. Given the case and what's going on, you expect that support journey will go beyond the different services as they are. So it'll go beyond, in round one's case, April 2028. And we've got a number of scenarios that exist under that. So scenario one is potentially the easiest, is where you already know that you're going to be part of or even leading one of these new regional partnerships in the future. Our blanket assumption is, where that is the case, that you will continue to keep your client and you will continue to support them from the old unto the new. And from a client's perspective, they won't perceive any particular change in journey. Scenario two is the idea that you'll have a provider that is then not part of any of the 2028 partnerships. So that means at some point a decision will need to be made about informing the client that the current provider is no longer in receipt of MAPS funding. And then what we tried to do is put client choice in the heart of this. So the client should then be given a choice of how their journey of debt advice and guidance support continues. Now, to do that, you need information as an advisor working with them. So it places an expectation that the new providers and the new partnerships will have provided the incumbent supplier with an outline and a description of their service offer, and the ability to articulate and describe that to a client in friendly and understandable ways. It makes an assumption that the new providers and the existing ones will have agreed processes and timelines for client records and cases to be transferred between. And it makes an assumption that the timeline to do that, and actually when clients will start being informed of that, will also be agreed, to enable that kind of case progression to go along. So this is another example of where to do an activity means that a number of other activities will have had to have happened earlier up in the timeline or the chain. So we started mapping out what some of those routes could then look like. So you've got scenario, what I've called here 2A, which is where you just have one regional lead in a region, at which point the client's informed of the change. The lead partner would then accept the client from the incumbent, and practically speaking, we know it's going to be moved to the most appropriate place within their partnership. The assumption being probably based on geography or SME or client need, depending on the journey that they want. We've got scenario two, where you've got multiple leads within a region, or multiple partnerships within a region, shall I say, at which point that idea of client choice becomes more so, in that the client will, we assume, have been presented the options for those multiple partnerships and then chosen where they want their advice journey to continue. And then we've got what I'm calling option C, which is the current provider actually says, we might not be receiving MAPS funding in the future, but it's our assessment that we're going to still be delivering debt advice thereafter. It's probably in the client's best interest that they continue working with us. We'll give them the option to move to those new partnerships, or give them the option to stay with us, but not funded by MAPS. And I've tried to start working out what this means in terms of actually those blocks of activities and where they would stand within the timeline. So for some of this, there's an expectation that it'll start during the mobilization, but before that sort of demobilization phase with the new provider. So working out actually how data sharing partnerships within your partnership will work will come earlier and is irrespective of like that demobilization crossover. Working out what your outline of your service offer is going to be, both to the public facing advisors and clients, can come during that period. There's then the assumption that once you've worked that out and you've agreed and met with incumbents, that you'll test the process. It's not going to go live on day one without testing. There's an assumption that incumbents might be putting together dummy case files so you can see the type of data that's coming across, test to see how well it integrates within your CRMs or systems. And then it's after you've tested that, worked out, made sure it actually works, that's the point where clients would start to be informed of change of services and made those offers. And then obviously during the transfer, you've got client data being transferred ahead and supported. And then new providers sort of reaches out to that customer then proactively to let them know what's going on. And then post-transfer, support would continue in the new partnership. And then there's still some continuing obligations on the incumbent provider, such as archiving of records, setting destroy dates, etc. And then I think the last of our sort of morning exercises, and then I'll take 2 seconds for tea. There's a lot that could occur during this period. So I've got a lot of prompt questions here in terms of this, because whilst I can sit here and say, of course, you'll transfer all the client records across to the new provider, one of the things that we want to make sure we get right is that everyone has a common understanding of what that means. It's not, here's their name, their address, and a phone number. It's actually what's in the case notes. Do we want to have the actual historic call recordings coming across if you're doing those as well? Because it's that difference between a generic term of case record versus the practical of what's actually all the items within. Similarly, you'll need to make sure that you've done data protection checks, etc. And one of the things that we want to get kind of clear from you, because as a sector, you know better than us, when is the best time to tell a client about this on their sort of journey? Who is in a position to make that assessment that you think the journey will extend across 2 periods of time? And then is actually customer choice, where you've got multiple places that they could go, the best way to do this? Because we do appreciate that some of you will be setting up new partnerships and new branding to go with it. And that might play a factor or a role in it as well. So on to TUPE and staff retention strategies. So again, your thoughts in blue at the top. We asked for details around sort of roles and responsibilities when it came to TUPE and what existing staff should be expecting to see. Again, there was a real strong emphasis from people that we wanted to minimize disruption, but also worry and concern and long periods of time where you don't have certainty about what the future is going to hold. And we know if you're expert, I've personally been tupied, and not knowing what the future is going to be and having to wait and wait sometimes quite long periods in silence is really nerve-wracking. It's not great for your social health. And honestly, you start looking out the window for other opportunities. And we recognize that the debt sector is a wonderful, dedicated, highly talented, and experienced pool, and we don't want to lose that through the actions that we do. So, to re-emphasize, we do have 4 lead suppliers at the moment who have between them over 100 separate advice organizations within their partnerships. The new services that we are commissioning are significantly similar to the current RON in the sense that we've got local debt advice provision being delivered via a number of different channels within those regions. So TUPE is likely to apply. This is not me giving legal advice, this is me giving an opinion. And if you want guidance on what TUPE means, there is, and I put it here in the slide, the government link. What I'll also say, what I've put in here as well, is the ACAS link, because if I'm being really honest with this audience, the ACAS link is a lot easier to read than the government guidance. The government guidance that said is not bad for government support. Whoever wrote it on .gov, I think, did a pretty good job. But to summarize at a really high level, TUPE, if it applies, essentially protects incumbent staff and allows them, or markedly, if it's found to apply, they are offered similar roles and positions within new partnerships and new structures. Not always, there are some caveats within it. And the employees' jobs usually then transfer over to that new company. They retain their existing terms and conditions, and their employment is maintained. There are some nuances, for example, within that. Somebody asked over the summer for a quick note on pensions. And whilst your salary and T's and C's will move across, actually there isn't an obligation on your new employer to continue the exact terms and conditions of your pension. It's quite likely that actually that you'll be transferred onto the nearest equivalent within your new employee instead. And the thing with TUPE is there is lots of little nuances within it. We've been thinking about what that means in terms of supporting you, because we recognize that both you and ourselves have differing levels of experience with TUPE itself. One of the big considerations and learnings that we've had from previous exercises has been to allow that longer mobilization period. We've attempted in the past to mobilize things over a quarter, so 3 months. That has not been enough time historically to do those job assessment roles, seek legal advice, work through the consequences of it, do the backwards and forwards between old and new, and set up and prep people for where they could be moving over to. We've tried it. We've done it very quickly, but definitely the learning was we need to make sure that we take the time, giving both partnerships and incumbents the ability to get it right. MAP's role within this has historically been facilitative, in the sense that we'll provide guidance to you. We'll set up meetings between new partner leads and incumbents to allow those conversations to occur. One of the things that we have taken very strongly on board is that with CBDA, it's about us listening to you and what you need and trying to be less directive and imposing. And we've considered what role MAPS could have in TUPE. So I've been speaking to MAPS in-house TUPE experts, and what they've been saying to me is there's opportunities here for us to create a high-level resource pack and checklist which will outline key considerations and thoughts that both incumbents and new partners will need to have. So this will cover staff transfer, the aforementioned pensions, some HR processes, although they have stressed to me that this is not MAPS giving legal advice. This is us trying to source best practice, and indeed where other established sources of information exist, being able to find those and put them front and center for you so that you can then use them. So I think a good example of this is the aforementioned ACAS website. So they're the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. They've put together a really good resource pack when it comes to checklists, for example, for new employees and old employees. So I've just pulled it out to sort of illustrate slightly here. So they've put it together essentially like a checklist of the things that your new employee should do before staff transfers occur, and similarly a checklist for old employers. And I've pulled out an example from it for like what they call the transfer day, which is effectively like the first day with your new employee, and it details some of the other sections anyway, detail the high level and legal responsibilities and things you need to have done. But this also contains best practice in terms of actually what you should be doing as a new employee or a new employer on the first day. And it's that sort of thing where we think maps can have a real role for bringing it together and facilitating you in this process. Similarly, we wanted to be transparent about what information you should expect. So if you read the TUPE guidance as sort of is, it's very close to the wire. It talks about like 30 days before go live transfers and all the rest of it. From our experience and from what you've told us, that's not enough time. So what we've started to do in our more recent commissioning exercises is we've asked incumbents suppliers for that TUPE information to try and make it available at the point where you are putting your proposals together and bidding. So you can see what the incumbent staffing looks like. You can see what the salaries, the pension requirements, all the rest of it are. So what I've put on the screen is the template that we use. It's the one that we've literally just used in another grant commissioning exercise. So that's the detail that we're planning to ask our incumbent suppliers for, and if we can, to publish at the time of the rounds going live, so that you can see, understand it, and interrogate the logic to it. That worked quite well on the last funding round that we did. When it comes to something like job descriptions, for example, because there is a stage in TUPE where you're effectively marrying up the scope and specification and roles for your new services versus the incumbents. That we've tended to do post-award, because otherwise it's just a little bit too much information to put out there, and it makes more sense sort of like after award itself. We were asked to talk a little bit about staff retention strategies as part of the summer engagements. That said, we did interrogate some of the data and went back to a few people to sort of clarify what they meant by that. And as I've hopefully emphasized throughout a lot of today, what people have actually said was, we don't want maps to tell us how to retain our staff. We don't want you suggesting Pizza Fridays or anything like that. What we want you to do is make sure that you are being open and transparent about your timings. So when are the funding decisions going to be known? When do we as incumbents know that the new partnerships will have reached out to us to do things? When will new partners have interrogated the staffing data and be able to tell us when they think TUPE does or does not apply? When will we, as a worker on the front line, when am I going to know what my options are in where I could potentially move? And so this is why we've sort of tried to illustrate through this in the previous slides, and indeed that mobilization timeline that we looked right at the top. We can provide more clarity by doing suggested milestones or points in the timeline where we think those activities should have been concluded within the mobilization period, rather than just leaving it as that big blank 9 months black box mystery. And we're hoping that's the interpretation is correct based on what you've said. So we're definitely reviewing retention strategies in the idea of giving people clarity before the Christmas holidays, not leaving it to the last minute. And then on exit planning and redundancy. So strong feedback again during the summer around that we needed to have a sensible plan for the end of the grants. Included within that plan, the logic for redundancy, the case transfers that we just talked about, and record keeping. And again, it goes back to the slide that I just mentioned about transparency and expectations and timelines. So we've looked at actually how we can work with our incumbents. So the new grant agreement, which if you are successful and the lead would be signing to take part in CBDA 28, places this idea when it comes to exit activity that incumbent suppliers will assist MAPS with transferring a service and provide information and assistance that is relevant and reasonable. And it's those two keywords that I wanted to highlight because right now, all of you on this call, and indeed all of our incumbent and future suppliers, can have a role in this by telling us what you think is relevant and reasonable to get during the exit and demobilization phase. So today and in future sessions, as we draft this up, is a real opportunity to set those expectations on what we'll be requesting from incumbents and indeed what new providers or new partnerships will be giving to those incumbents to allow a smoother exit. So thinking about that, there are further guidance and actions that MAPS can take. So we will be asking all of our incumbents to update and amend their exit plans. We will be taking your feedback from sessions like today, the market engagement work that we did in the spring and the summer, and indeed those phase 3 regional workshops that Matt is running to amend and update our exit plan sort of like templates and systems. We've also got opportunity within MAPS to provide support to existing providers and incumbents, but also roll that forward into what the exit of CBDA 28 could look like. And I put on the screen a checklist for some of the things that we can cover. So how communications will work, how reviews, reconciliation, clawback, how audit would work, how lessons learned. This is something that we can put together as a pack for incumbents to let them know, but it also means that as a new partnership coming in, you can have an expectation that activities like this will have occurred. And I think this might be actually our last sort of Slido and exercise for the day, which is around exit planning activities. So we were relatively clear from a legalistic position what information we need to ask current incumbents for as part of TUPE transfers and what we can share. But actually, when it comes to exiting and moving services across, there's other considerations that might actually be really helpful to you as new partners or grant leads. And so we've been trying to think, and then we realized, why think about it? We can ask you. You know more than us what you're concerned about either getting or not getting. This goes back to my sort of like reasonable and relevant. So if you tell us you definitely need some sort of information because it will assist you in doing so, this is the opportunity to tick that reasonable and relevant box. So for example, I've come up with a few bits here, such as if there are assets in use by the current incumbents, which will no longer be used or necessary for them, would you want to know that? For example, if they've got a I don't know, bus or mobile outreach van that they use to go about like the regions, actually, is that a saving to you if you just inherit that from them, for want of a better description, rebrand it, etc., rather than going out and procuring a new? Is it helpful to get earlier access to incumbents' job descriptions for their staff role? Is it helpful to understand at the point of putting your bids together what software people are using to use that for their CRM or their case management systems? Is it useful to have a list of staff, for example, that will definitely be needed at the point of exit of our incumbent services? The classical one that we always think about in my part of the MAPS world is project managers and budget managers. We know that there will be a final grant claim and a final grant reconciliation. We know there will be final reporting. That will not get done at 5 o'clock on the last day of March. That will need to happen in post, which places an obligation that staffing, or at least some sort of staff, will be there. So if a project manager is trooping across, we need to understand at what point that will happen, at what point they might need to still be doing some historic obligations. And indeed, when it comes to communicating your services, what might be helpful for new leads in terms of actually, should there be an expectation of at some point along the calendar, we'll be updating referrers into older services and regions. So if you're coming up with a big new brand, at what point might we expect that new brand to be up and live so that it can be communicated outwards? And then similarly, are there key contacts within those regions that actually, do we need to update them? Would that be left to incumbents to let know, or would you want actually to know who they're constantly engaging with to make happen? It could be that incumbents consider that more like proprietary to their own organization, so it's clearly off the table. But it's helpful if you tell us that you think it's relevant or reasonable to ask for such information. And then with about 30 minutes to go, we were asked to talk about project management, partnerships, and the mobilization and onboarding of partners, specifically definitions and roles within that partnership and what MAPS's expectations might be, or indeed what partners within a new partnership might have of their lead. So there were some questions about if we're in a position to offer good practice and setting up those governance and sub-partner roles as well. So I'll start by saying not all partners are going to be, or more clearly, not all regional groupings are going to be doing the same thing. Ultimately, it will be the responsibility of the lead partner for signing the grant agreement with MAPS and being responsible for the delivery of the objectives and the strategy of the CBDA program. Now, MAPS will be using the Model Grant Funding Agreement. This is one that was developed by the Government Grants Management Function, so it's had quite a lot of robust central government kicking around. We will issue this document to the lead partners to sign, and then again, making sure that you can adapt services to what you need in your region. It'll be for that lead partner to define the functions, responsibilities, and requirements within their partnership. However, it does contain quite a useful framework for how those partnership relations could work. So the Model Grant Funding Agreement outlines things like the duration and the purpose of the grant, eligible and ineligible expenditure, the monitoring and reporting arrangements, auditing and assurance, finance management, data protection, intellectual property. And we were mulling this from actually a practicality perspective. So we would I'm trying to avoid using the word advice. Lead partners should consider effectively taking that model grant funding agreement and using an adaptation of it within their partnership. So rather glibly internally, someone said, copy and paste the word MAPS within it with your own name and copy and paste your own name with that of your sub partner and then start making edits from that point. That way you know that any obligations placed upon you as the lead are then reflected in that sub-grantee or reflected on that sub-grantee and actually in the agreement itself. So a little bit about what MAPS will do again during that mobilization period when we're thinking about project management and partnership onboarding. So as I said right at the top, when we're looking at that timeline, we'll meet with lead partners, we'll exchange details, obviously first one offering congratulations, but you'll get to know who within MAPS will be your points of contact and who will support you with what. As I said at the beginning as well, we'll go through the terms and conditions of the grant funding agreement so you understand actually what the obligations mean in terms of our expectations of you, but also what your expectations of us will be because we're both signing this. There are some key documents that we'll also be showing as part of this too. So we'll put together things like reporting templates, how we as MAPS want data recorded and reported back to us. As I say, we've got the evidencing deep dive session coming up in that first week of December, so I won't talk to that in too much detail. Catherine, the other week, also talked about how we'll undertake our quality monitoring arrangements as well. And we'll also talk through and provide guidance on how we'd want things like social value reported back to us. So for these elements, Maps will be providing you with templates and expectations for the types of data and how it'll be recorded. And it makes sense that from a lead partner perspective, you'll be cascading that across your supply chain as well as they bring it together in a whole. Key to this will be the mobilization plan. So this is your, well, as we've outlined here, the sort of the first 6 to 9 months of your delivery and will form an element of your delivery plan when you submit your proposals to us, but we'll start boosting that up, I think, during mobilization phase. So putting more detail in there. In that, obviously, we'll cover things like the expectations, both from you and of us, start to break down some of those tasks that we expect both parties to kind of complete during the period. And we'll also outline and make the sort of the timeline arrangements for due diligence as well. And then in terms of, we got a number of specific questions to us about what we could potentially help with during that mobilization as well. So there were some specific questions about how Maps can help with the drafting of sub-agreements. So as I said before, our soft tip is if you take our grant agreement with you, that's probably our best advice for, or more likely our best guidance for where to start from. We do make some soft expectations, for example, that if we are awarding a grant agreement for 7 years or so, so a long-term commitment for funding, which is what the sector has told us we definitely should be doing, there is the assumption that there will be a reflection of that within the grant agreements that you have with your sub-partners too. Similarly, we were asked for guidance on things like memorandums of understanding. So for those of you who are curious, MOUs are basically slightly pseudo-legalized gentlemen's agreements between organizations. Because of this, and because they tend to reflect softer relationships between organizations, it's not something that Maps is in a position to particularly advise you on. It also starts to blur like the ownership should parties not do what they expect each other to do. That said, though, when it comes to another couple of areas that were called out to us as where Maps could have a role around due diligence and risk. So we will be providing people with a comprehensive list of the due diligence that we would expect to be in place with the grant holder. And then we'd expect those to be cascaded into any of the sub-agreements you have. Similarly, within the risks itself of onboarding partners, Maps will put together a risk and indeed issues and change template, which we'll make available to you. But when it comes to actually providing example risks and best practice, there are a number of third-party guides already out there in existence that we would either encourage you to find or we could potentially collate as a point of reference. Because it's something that other people honestly have more experience than we as Maps do. And then similarly, we were asked if we could provide either like further workshops or guidance. So again, I'm going to shout out Matt's work in the bite-sized sessions in the future. We were asked specifically as part of mobilization about customer experience and quality. What I'll say is Catherine's deep dive last week covered that in depth with yourself in a number of sort of breakout workshops. We will be looking to update those indicative mobilization timelines that I talked about at the start once she's managed to get through all the good stuff that was talked about last week. There was questions about what sort of monitoring and reporting partners should be expected to do within the partnership. Again, I would say that that would draw down from the terms that we put into that model grant agreement with the leads, but generally speaking, best practice guidance has been that grant holders would hold quarterly meetings with their supply chain. This might scale in terms of regularity depending on what changes and iterations are going on. It might just be soft touch-ins, or it might be themed meetings. It really comes down actually to what activities and the scale and size of your partnerships. And it's not a case of one shoe fits all. We were also asked about guidance on setting up governance structures for multiple providers in the region. This is not something that actually MAPS has direct experience of doing. So we don't want to give you a poor steer by making that up. That said, we can provide, because we have developed in the past, agendas and meetings and the like, which we can share that are based on sort of our own best practice and usage in the past. Similarly, we were also explicitly asked if we had any guidance we could give about setting up new venues for outreach, the use of new equipment, or indeed increasing the accessibility of services. I'll give a soft shout out to the MAPS Impact Report, which goes out every year, which gives a few examples of some of this activity. But truth be told, this is not MAPS's direct experience or specialism. So again, we don't necessarily want to give you bad steers by giving you guidance on something that we've not actually done. Um, yeah, and just a general note about sort of partnership working at the end there as well. And then I think, yeah, we were asked a little bit about due diligence as well. So initially, I was planning to come to you with a big list of all the documents that we'll ask for by when and covering what. However, CBDA has been an opportunity for us as MAPS to think about actually how we approach due diligence and our work with the sector. So we've considered, and what we're actually undertaking at the moment, and it's unfortunately not concluded by the point of this call, is taking a more risk-based approach to due diligence. So for example, if you have, let's say, so data protection, let's pick that. We've always asked our incumbent suppliers for copies of their data protection policies, which usually include what would happen if someone essentially attempts to hack you. And then we also asked for things like the disaster recovery policies. In the past, we've looked at and said, we've received these documents, and that gives us assurance that a process is in place, and that is enough assurance that we think the risk has been mitigated before it's happened. What we're thinking about now is actually, do we need to have SME skills or people in-house to be reviewing those documents, interrogating them and understanding actually if those plans and documents and policies give us that assurance that our activities are occurring. A sort of a softer example might be if you have an employee well-being policy. We've taken that in the past and gone, good, we can see evidence that they are doing these types of activities. But if you read through them and you take a social policy expert, they might go through it and say, oh, I've looked at this and we have no idea or evidence that people can get 360 feedback or do take this up, or they do take rest points if a call has been quite demanding upon them. So actually, this is the question both for us and I think as the sector, as we go through this, is working out, is it enough just to have a document, or actually do we need to have the in-house expertise, both on your side and ours, to understand if the documents that we've received are good? So rather than leave this as blank, I thought I'd give you some examples of the type of due diligence activities that we're going to be covering. So the aforementioned data protection, information security, health and safety, intellectual property, and indeed software and consultancy services. And then I think this is going to be our last section before I go to sort of like wrap up and open questions, is we're asked to talk a little bit about data systems migration and information governance. I think this comes down mainly to people wanting to understand how they could do this, both as part of new partnerships, but also in terms of sharing and transferring data during the mobilization period explicitly. So we received a question about case management integration. So that's within new partnerships within the region. we would say that this is one of those cases where, for you, the benefits of integrating and using the same systems and software would need to exceed the risks, the time, and the costs. However, mobilization is a really good time to test and try and pay for such activities. That said, you would need to have a robust and reasonable timeline for the partnership to agree the system that you'll be trying to use. However, it might also be that you use the mobilization period to develop those, what I'm going to call the intermediary steps. So where you've got multiple suppliers using different systems, you know you need to report upwards and be joined. So it might be that you create a certain intermediary middle format for these so that it all flows into one universal format at the end, usually in the care of the lead partner. It's one where, admittedly, as well, and this is why I mentioned when we were talking about budgeting, those things take time, they take expertise, and they take costs. So if you're planning to do that, and it is a reasonable mobilization activity to do, make sure that you have assessed and costed it fully. Similarly, we had questions about case migration in the sense, and we interpret this as being between existing incumbent suppliers and new providers. Whilst the mobilization and demobilization phases are relatively long, we weren't expecting the same level of case management integration for this at all. Historically, this has been done peer-to-peer between incumbent and new supplier. And usually it has been done by agreeing effectively the column headings and the format of the data type that goes in when you're transferring those customer records so that they can then be integrated at the other end. So there's usually a middle step between the two. Similarly with data sharing, we got asked some questions around the level of data sharing assurance that a lead partner might need to do. So there are, if you have effectively like a sub-agreement in place within your partnership, that should cover data sharing arrangements. That is covered in the model grant funding agreement that we'll be using. So again, if you take the example of R1 and then replicate it forwards, it'll provide you with that coverage. Or if you just use that as the basis for your own terminology, that might work. Similarly, we had questions about information governance. I've been talking to MAPS, data protection officers and the like, and they've recommended that we'll be doing, as MAPS, a data protection impact assessment between us and the new partnership. They recommend that the lead partner also does a DPO with both their new partnership and if there is a transfer of records from incumbent, the same thing would apply as well. Perfect. I knew I was going to talk about DPOs. So yeah, that is basically what I've said. In terms of the nature of the model grant funding agreement and the relationship that MAPS is at this time assuming, is we're assuming that we'll have joint controllers a relationship within the grant funding agreement, which means that we and the incumbents can, or future winners, as it were, can share data sort of freely between. It might be that you have different types of relationships within your partnership, especially if you've got organizations that are just there to refer into you, but you formalize them up slightly. This is definitely one which requires somebody within your organization or your partnership to have data protection knowledge. It's a specialism. There's lots of legality that goes into it, and it's one that is useful to consider as a role and a function that you will need to budget for and include within that mobilization period and activity. We got asked about audit schedules. So audits can be both, let's say, harder and soft in the terms of regular monitoring. Again, the model grant funding agreement will put in there the sort of the key dates and requirements for audit. You as leads and supply chains may have separate timelines that you wish to do during the period as well. And then I think it might have been Lucy, question mark, if I scroll up far enough, asked about Cyber Essentials Plus. So lead providers would need to have Cyber Essentials Plus at the point of signing the grant agreement, it will be a requirement for all debt advice providers to have at the time that the services goes live. This does mean, however, that you can include the costs and activities for gaining Cyber Essentials Plus as part of the mobilization phase itself. So if you don't have it at the start, and we can have a timeline that works, you could get it by the end of mobilization and not be precluded from the work. And as a caveated note, where a sub-grantee is not handling sensitive client-focused data, we don't put that obligation. So CE Plus would not be required. I'll wrap up and then I'll open to sort of open questions for the last 5 minutes or so. In terms of readiness, it would be helpful following the digestion of what we've talked about today to gain an understanding of how ready you think you are for some of these. As I've trailed throughout this, we're going to be doing more regionally focused bite-sized workshops in the new year. You can set our agenda for some of those by telling us now, and we will include it. And just to reiterate sort of what our next steps are. So we're doing these deep dive sessions. We've got data and engagement next week. We've got expressions of interest in December. And I think we've had some questions in the general chat about that so far. And then in that new year, we'll be doing those regional market engagement sessions as well. And then the competition will open in the spring. Yeah, I've duplicated my slide. Excellent. Yep, so big shout out. Data and evidence next week. There is a general email address here, which is commercial@maps.org, where if you have burning questions or shower thoughts for the rest of the week and over the weekend, etc., actually, to be honest with you, into the new year as well, you can put them in there. I will leave the Slido polls and links open, I think, well into tomorrow. What we'll do is we'll collate responses and try and theme those up and play them back into the slide deck. Similarly, where there have been questions in the chat and we're able to give answers to them, I'll see if I can put those in the deck as well, so that it's all shared, so that those who couldn't attend today have the opportunity to see what was discussed and what was answered. And I think that was our conclusion. So I was going to open the floor for 5 minutes of Q&A or so. I appreciate this has been a long 2 hours and there has been a lot of technicalities within it, and apologies once again for the technical detail difficulties that we had at the start. So I'll open it to the floor. If anyone has any questions, you could post them in chat or raise your hand and I will come to you. Erica, by the way, I see you've been answering questions as we go through. Are there any that you want to specifically sort of call out in case people haven't seen them?
I think the main questions probably linked to stuff that we've already talked about, David, which is about making sure that we've got a proportionate approach to some of the kind of testing that we're doing, that we'll be doing, filling gaps rather than kind of duplicating as far as possible. So that was one of the key questions of interest. There was a separate question about kind of whether we will be kind of looking at national services separately. I think it's probably outside the scope of this webinar, but suffice to say that essentially it is for local partnerships to determine what they think the gaps are locally. So by all means, kind of make those connections where it's useful to do that. But apart from that, I think most of the comments linked to some of the technical difficulties we've experienced, but thankfully we've made it through.
I've learned a lot about not ending webinars to then test to see if it all works. Brilliant.
In the absence of any further questions, I think it's probably thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your week.